First of all, it is intrinsic and in the brain. Look at Elsie and his mom, and let's look closely at their brains. Clearly they're attached, and the attachment is really between parts of the one brain and parts of the other. It's built into each brain. Where does an attachment exist? It exists in the brain, and we have three parts of the brain at least, depending on how you cut it. We have a cortex where we think, we have limbic system, which is our emotional kind of things. We have archaic brain or lower brains, which is kind of regulatory. It's pretty clear attachment is in the limbic system, but there's a strong cortical support for it too. So how do we know that? The cortical support is thinking, talking, planning, your logical, your language, all of that, things that we're doing right now. The limbic system is emotional brain, our connecting with people, anger, love, sadness, grief, all those things are triggered in the limbic system. And the archaic or older brain is really regulatory. It keeps us breathing the right amount. It keeps our heart rate at the right speed, fluid balance. Those things in kids are all already pretty much in place in newborns. So thinking brain, cortex, is where we think we live. But of course, that's because we're thinking. And so we think we live there. The limbic system is where poets know we live. That's why, you know, they can write poetry that can trigger all those things. And we need to know that we don't live in our cortex. We have all sorts of places in our brain that we live. And the archaic brain is so that we can live. It's just keeping us sort of basic thing. Let's look closer at the mom here and look at attachment as it's just starting. In the newborn, I grayed out the two top ones because the newborn's just mostly kind of got that basics and then some reflexes like I mentioned. But in the mom, she's forming a representation in her brain of this person that she's attached to. She is building that representation. And she's using architecture that she already has. And I say she because mom's attachment has got a lot more time usually for most kids, but it really goes to any adult who's attaching to any person. The architecture that's already in place because you were attached to somebody when you were 3, that built your brain those first 3 years, and now you can do it more easily. It doesn't mean you can't attach if you had bad attachments, but boy, it's a lot harder. We know it's a lot harder. Kids from Romanian orphanages that really had a very disconnected first 3 or 4 years, they can learn to parent and even attach, but it's probably a lot of it's kind of cortical learning where they know what to do. They don't feel what to do quite as easy, but they can learn to be good parents. But she already has the architecture. She has all her prenatal experience starting from the very first moment of thinking about, oh, that kid was really in there, and you see the pictures of 3D ultrasound and you feel the kicks and you're starting to build that picture in your brain already. Hormonal support, her body is flooded with different emotions and she's already sort of making that, and once the kid's born, birth triggers all the oxytocin kind of support for attachment, so it's a really high attachment time. She's got this engaging baby that's born, and all of a sudden this kid is looking at him and looking at her and making these eyes at her. You know, those are all things that are attaching, and they have time together. You have to have those. And those are all important. You can attach without any one of them probably, but really when they're all there and all supporting attachment happens, and it's a really a neat thing for the mom. So she's building it, and the cortical structures can help. Now the baby's starting out with, doesn't have that architecture, but they do eventually build that limbic system attachment architecture, and they get that representation of the person they're attached to in their limbic system and also in their cortical system. So consistent, caring adults who are attaching to them, that's a really crucial thing. I mean, they're not going to attach if they don't have that. Babies also, or kids also attach to dolls and to other things. It's using some of the same mechanism, but it's really not going to build that part of your brain unless it's really reacting. And it's that serve and return. The baby does something and the mom does it back or the dad does it back. That's starting to build the connections in their brain.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
Stress and stress relief is a very important thing. The baby's stressed because they're hungry, they cry, their cry has an effect on the mom, and now the two things happen. Oh, the mom can feed the baby or the dad can feed the baby. Now they're both kind of, oh, that stress went away. Stress is not bad, stress is a normal thing, but having it go away in the presence of somebody really helps build that attachment. Physical comfort are really important, and that's part of building attachment. And time together. You can't do it unless you have time together. And it has to be the right timing, because it really has to be in that time when you're forming those attachments. Certainly the last 2/3 of the first year is a really important time that you just need people in there to do it quicker. And then, of course, you need to build that brain development, so now you have your limbic system and your attachment mechanism in the limbic system, and each of them is important. Now, this baby can attach to lots of people. That's not a limited resource. And the only way that I know of that you can prevent attaching to many people is that one of the people is trying to block the other one. The parent and the foster parent are both saying, I'm not going to let that person attach to that baby because that's mine, or because they're not good for him, or whatever. That'll block things. Or two parents can be fighting about who's going to be attached or whatever. But if you don't do that, kids can attach to moms, grandmothers, uncles, the neighbor next door, anybody who's in their environment, and serve and return kind of things with them. It's hard to measure. How do you measure attachment? We don't have any way to brain scan it and say, oh, the brain scan shows you're attached and this one shows you're not. We might get there someday with functional scanning, but we're not there now. There's no way to scan a kid's brain and say, yeah, that's a good, strong attachment. No blood tests, no objective tests. All we have is what you see. We look and see behavior and we say that behavior is like attachment. Caring, attentive, interactive, protective, wanting connection, that we say, oh, that parent is attached. And a baby that's comforted with the mom, that they're upset with separation, they're calmed when the person comes back. That's sort of the researchy definition. If you want to study attachment, you got to have something. And they want connection. They're working to be connected with that person. The flip side of attachment, I mentioned already briefly, is mourning. To the extent you have attachment, when it breaks, you have mourning. And mourning, any of you know that have lost somebody close to you? And in this culture, you can get to be very old without having that happen very dramatically. I recently, in the last 6 years, lost both my parents, but they were 91 and 98. So I went a long time before I had that particular loss. But anytime you have a very significant loss, it's a very significant mourning. And mourning in kids too, you can see they don't look the same. Kids mourn with a very losing developmental skills or upsetting their rhythms or upsetting eating and sleeping. But adults have that plus chest pain, and they can tell you about it. Be careful, because someone who's mourning a loss might look hostile, angry, unconnected. You say, oh, that mom, if she were really attached, she'd be cooperating with us. Well, duh, no. You've just took the baby away from the mother wolf who's attached. You know, you think they're going to thank you. No. And we don't want to make them have to thank you. Later say, hey, you can still be connected. We just have to make sure it's safe. So, and in kids, just the upset can look like, oh, maybe they're not attached, but they're really just mourning that loss. You've traumatized them by breaking a connection. It's necessary for growth. Kids won't grow if they're not attached. They won't develop their immune system. We have lots of experiments of history where or the kids in Romanian orphanages where we don't let them attach. They won't develop, they won't learn, they won't build a brain. And so it's as important as air and water. Attachments are as important as air and water. Here's a little kid in Galveston that was cared for, food and water and shelter, but nobody was there in that kid's life, no person. And here's what this little kid, he's 9 months old. He looks much less, he's very wasted. He's losing a lot of milk because he's self-stimulating by regurgitating his formula that he does get back up because that somehow feels better, but he won't deal with anyone, he won't look at anyone. If you try, he is going to avoid you. He's already 9 months, he's really good at on the way to dying if you don't. And he was rescued in the hospital. It was kind of an old video because they rescued him with hospital staff and nobody mentioned like who's the next step, and so they were setting him up for another bunch of mourning. And obviously if we rescue this kid, we want to build attachments with someone who will be there, not someone who's going to leave. So this is a picture I try to share with all the workers and just say, it's as important as air and water. When we do anything that impinges on that kid's attachments, we are turning down his air on his air tank. If this is a kid, I think it's a kid in a scuba gear, you know, you're sneaking up behind him and you turn down the air. You know, sometimes you have to do it. It's bad air, it's dangerous, but you have to remember I turned down the air, and you have to work really hard every day to get that air turned back up, get him back connected. And whenever possible, don't do it. And if you have to do it, get it back up, turned up, get that attachment back in there. It's protective from smoking. We know kids that don't have attachments are going to smoke more. We know they're going to have more risk of other addictions, alcohol and drugs. We know depression is more likely. We know if they're in Katrina and everything's wiped out around them and it's huge trauma, if they have a connected person, they're much protected from that. And so it's really protective. We have to build them because kids need them to sort of deal with all kinds of things. And if we don't give it, they're going to pick up some bad habits or bad behaviors. And it's also therapeutic. When this kid is traumatized, we know that an attachment is the most powerful thing to protect long run. So because of the attachment, the trauma gets less. It's from Bruce Perry's book, and those of you who saw him, you know, are lucky, and the book is called The Child Who Raises a Dog. And actually, you could do the other one too, but there's probably a book like that. But the name's misleading because it might make you think, oh, it's just this one book about a terrible case, but it's really all the kind of things he's learned. He said, what maltreated and traumatized children most need is a healthy community to buffer the pain, distress, and loss caused by their earlier trauma. Attachments, connections, connectedness buffers trauma. What works to heal them is anything that increases the number and quality of a child's relationships. What helps is consistent, patient, repetitive, loving care, unconditional love. There are places in the United States where the psychiatric hospital has bubble of love therapy. You know, that's what we're going to do, is we're going to surround this kid with loving, connected people, no matter how bad they are. And I should add, he says, what doesn't work is well-intended but poorly trained mental health professionals rushing in after a traumatic event or coercing children to open up or get out their anger. That doesn't help. He has a really good, honest approach, and it's nice to hear a psychiatrist say, well, the most important thing we do is we facilitate attachment. And attachment to us, in fact, is a really big part of therapy, but it's not long-term attachment, so basically you have to do the broader one.